This past Tuesday, my Bible study asked a very important question prompted by the topic for the evening, and the topic was very appropriately Jesus that night. The question was this: how would you describe Jesus? And we got to the standard answers that would come from a group that had grown up in the church, that Jesus was God, that he was a friend, a teacher, a prophet, that he could be described as light and life and love, all of those things. But it prompted a discussion about how we and others perceive Jesus and how we might describe Jesus to someone else who might not know him the way we do. And if we consider today's account of the Transfiguration, it might be very difficult for us to do. How does one describe what happened up on that mountain? And how do we describe a transfigured Jesus even when we don't fully understand it ourselves? After all, the three disciples hardly knew or understood what they were seeing, and I think they represent many of us, people who are close to Jesus, but may at times struggle to describe the fullness of who Jesus is. One thing I hope for certain is this today, that we all want a life that is transformed or changed into a life that is more like Christ's. One that demonstrates his power and love. But that all depends on how you answer the question of who Jesus is to you. The Transfiguration can help us do that, and help us not only understand the full divinity of Jesus, but how the Transfiguration changes us in what we believe about Jesus, and therefore also changes our lives. It's a question that was asked of the disciples 8 days earlier. Jesus has them with him, and he asks them, "Who do people say that I am?" earlier in chapter 9. And in verse 19, they respond that some think Jesus is John the Baptist, that some think that he is Elijah, and still others that he is a prophet risen from the dead. But then Jesus asks a more pointed and probably more important question. He asks, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter answers that Jesus is the Messiah, sent from God, which is correct. But the Transfiguration is the act that solidifies Peter's confession, where Jesus is literally shown and heard to be God's Son, fully divine, not just human as the disciples have seen him. Luke says that it was glorious to see in verse 31. And it has such an impact on Peter that he suggests they make memorial shelters to remember the moment. And as he says this, they hear a voice from the cloud. "This is my Son, my chosen one. Listen to him." Jesus' identity is fully revealed to the three disciples, and not only has Jesus been changed before them, but they have been changed by what they have seen and heard and what they have witnessed about who Jesus really is on the mountaintop. I wonder if that's the same with you. Maybe it is. Maybe that occurred at some point with you. At some point in your relationship with Christ, you got a glimpse of who he really is and what he has done for us. It was a moment of transfiguration or change for you. Now, I should note that this happens all the time, or should happen all the time. We are all changing and growing, especially if we believe that our life is about becoming more like Christ. To live the Christian life is to be continually transfigured. We are all being called by God into becoming more than what and who we already are, and more into the likeness of Christ. But then again, that only comes by answering the question of who Jesus is to you. On the mountain, the disciples had a foretaste or a moment's glimpse of what heaven would be like. There on the mountain stood Jesus in all his glory. Did the disciples really understand what happened that moment? Did they recognize the importance of that experience? I wonder if they did. But it's like the boy in the following story. A little boy who was blind was taken to a famous specialist who said that an operation might give him sight. After the delicate operation was over, the little fellow opened his eyes and looked at his mother. But he did not know her, knowing only the sound of her voice and the touch of her hand. But when the mother spoke his name, his little arms went around her neck, and he said, "Mother, is this heaven?" Well, it must have been at least a little bit of a foretaste of heaven for that little boy. But if we put ourselves in the same place, we have heard God's voice in his word, and we have felt the loving touch of his guiding hand. But when we see him face to face, it will truly be heaven for us. But this mountaintop experience will only last for a moment, as powerful as it is, for immediately after this event, Jesus and his disciples must head back down into the valley, and it was very clear this is Jesus' call. They meet him on the way back down from the mountain. The crowd meets them with a demon-possessed boy. Jesus is called to go back down into the valley, and this valley journey will lead him to one inevitable place, and we know that place to be the cross. But we are called to do the same, to follow Jesus back down into the valley. As disciples of Jesus, we follow him down a narrow way. We walk alongside of him as he makes his way to do only what he could do. But the Transfiguration also shows us two sides of Jesus. First, his glory as he is transformed, and secondly, his suffering as he leaves the mountain and sets his eyes on Jerusalem and the cross. He tells the disciples after he comes down from the mountain that the Son of Man, Jesus, will be delivered up and killed, but on the third day will be raised up. Along the way to the cross, we will see whether the disciples really do listen to Jesus as they were told to do up on the mountain. Do the disciples understand these words of God, that Jesus is the Son of God, fully divine, and that God the Father really wants the disciples to listen to him? I want to ask you a strange question, at least it will sound strange. But when was the last time Christ was transfigured before you? Now, I know that's odd, but it's a question that really does go to the heart of how we are continuing to grow and prepare ourselves for life down in the valley. Our mountaintop experiences are what will carry us through the difficult moments of our faith. Where and when we need to remember what we have seen and heard about God's Son and be able to share that with others. So what transfiguring moments have you had lately? What mountaintop experience made you feel you were changed by Christ, especially in difficult times? Maybe it was an experience in worship when something became very clear to you. Maybe it was a moment in your own prayer or devotional life when a truth about Christ became real to you again, or even for the first time. But these moments help us when we grow comfortable with him as we know him. But we need to understand that Jesus wants to come and reveal himself freshly to us. And hopefully the results of these times of new revealing change our perception and understanding. And because they change our perception and understanding, we are fundamentally changed as well. Jesus seeks to readjust our vision of him, or the way we see him. The more we are willing to receive, the more he is willing to reveal to us his glory. He wants us to get a better glimpse of him, to see him as he really is, and he wants to change us to help us become more like him. In the Transfiguration, God is telling three disciples something very specific, but also very familiar. This is the season of Epiphany. We are in the middle of the season of Epiphany, and that means to have a revelation of or about Jesus. And the experience of the Transfiguration is like a bookend. It's like the back end to the season of Epiphany. At one end, or the beginning, there is the baptism of Jesus, and now at the end of Epiphany, there is this other bookend, which is the Transfiguration. Both are instances when the reality of who Jesus is noted in Scripture. God's voice is heard at both times, confirming Jesus' identity. In baptism, God says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And at the Transfiguration, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." And we note that those three words are very important at the end of the Transfiguration statement. God is telling the disciples to do something very specific at the Transfiguration, to listen to Jesus. Because Jesus is who he is, as witnessed powerfully on top of the mountain, not only is God pleased with Jesus, we have a responsibility to listen. And in this case, listening means to follow him and be obedient to what he says. It's one way we are changed by acknowledging Jesus as the Son of God, by listening and following. As we do so, we become more like him. It's us being transfigured, changed more into his likeness. And as we see the divinity of Jesus and respond by listening, even as difficult as it is sometimes, we become more holy ourselves. God told the disciples on the mountain to listen to Jesus, and that proved to be very difficult for the disciples. And if the disciples who were face to face with Jesus had a very difficult time listening and believing what he said, it just might be that the task is even more difficult for people who have not walked with Jesus while he was with one of the disciples, and that's us too. But we do have the Bible. We have these written stories of Jesus and his sayings. We do have the experience of the church down through the ages, which tells the story over and over again. And we have each other, our own personal experiences of Jesus' actions in our lives to convince us of his love and his mercy for us. So, on the outset, the account of the Transfiguration is about a special moment when Jesus' divinity was seen by the disciples. But a deeper understanding of this moment will also lead us to understand that while Jesus' appearance changed, it is the heart change that occurred in the disciples, especially Peter, that is just as powerful a message for us. Right in front of them, they have a mountaintop experience. It's one where, because their hearts have been changed, they are prepared to listen and to follow Jesus. We may not have an experience like they did, but our hearts should nonetheless be changed by the revelation of Jesus as fully divine, fully God's Son, not just an historical figure in the story of how God has saved the world. Because we know who Jesus is, it should change our perspective. Not only was Jesus like us in his humanity, but he was God of very God in his divinity, fully God and fully man. We don't just have faith in a man, though. We have faith in a God made man. And therefore, what he says and does are the things we listen to and try to emulate. To see or believe in Jesus' divinity is to be changed at the core of who we are. Not only was Jesus transfigured that day, but the three disciples were as well. And as we read this account, we too are challenged to be changed because of the truth of who Jesus is. We are changed like Christ. So, have you ever had a moment when you fully realized who Jesus is? Or have you had a moment when you fully realized what he's done? That's your moment of transfiguration. That's your moment of change. Hopefully, your life has not been the same since it has been changed in that way. But to be sure, it gives us strength to meet the demands of life in the valley and courage to face what we need to as we listen to and follow Jesus. May we continually seek moments whereby we understand Jesus better and better, and we see him for all that he is for us. In short, may we continually be changed like Christ. Amen.